Some truths don't vanish. They wait, quiet as dust beneath an old estate's carpets. This is a story of a family bound not by love but by silence, of a maid who gave up everything to stay close, and of a woman whose perfume lingered longer than her lies. What begins with a hidden child will end in a room where every seat is chosen, every secret weighed. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. There are few things I dislike more than returning to the brownstone soaked to the knees, unless it's doing so only to find someone else's umbrella dripping on our parquet floor. I'd just shaken off my coat in the vestibule when I noticed her, seated like a punctuation mark in the front room, motionless, with both hands folded over a black handbag that looked too stiff to be leather and too old to be new. The rest of her wasn't much different. She was young, maybe 23, but the starch in her bearing could have passed for 40. Her uniform marked her as a domestic, though her shoes weren't worn enough to suggest long hours. Her hair was dark, parted with precision, and her eyes were, well, wrong. Not scared, not blank, not even dull, just dry, wide open, looking straight ahead, as if waiting for something to begin. I stood a moment, studying her as she studied the floor. She didn't flinch, shift, or acknowledge me. A Tuesday night like any other, except the rain and the maid who stared at nothing. "Miss," I said finally. She looked up slowly, as if I'd asked her for something she hadn't quite decided to give. "I need to see Mr. Wolfe," she said, her voice level and calm, like someone requesting her time card. "Sure," I said. "We're always open for walk-in housemaids at 8:15, especially ones who look like they just dried off under a street lamp." That didn't crack her. She blinked once, unbothered. "I'm going to be arrested for murder," she added. That got me. I sat down opposite her and gave her the look I reserve for people who say strange things with the intention of sounding sincere. She didn't backpedal, didn't embellish, didn't even twitch. "I didn't kill her," she said. "But they think I did. I'm told that's enough." I don't often run short of words. Occupational hazard. But I had to clear my throat before I could ask the obvious. "Who is it you didn't kill?" She folded her hands tighter. "Mrs. Clarissa Arkrite, my employer." Then, just like that, silence returned. There are 3 ways to lure Nero Wolfe from the orchid rooms after dinner. One is fire, one is Fritz, and the third is me. And it only works half the time. I made my way up through the smell of damp bark and rare air, and found him in the northwest alcove, mid-lecture to a Mazdavalia hybrid that had recently displeased him. "I know," I said, "but I think you'll want to hear this one." He didn't glance up. "I don't want to hear any of them. This is Tuesday, Archie. It is raining. I am repotting." "She says she's going to be arrested for murder." He grunted. Not a yes, not a no, but a syllable that suggested his ears were no longer devoted entirely to botany. "And she came to see you?" He sighed, pulled a handkerchief from his vest, and began wiping his fingers. "Very well. Lead me to the performance." He entered, like a reluctantly summoned magistrate, full of contempt and stomach, and took the red armchair without bothering to look at her directly. I stood near the desk, mostly to see which one of them would break the silence first. "I am Nero Wolfe," he said eventually, "and I dislike melodrama. Please state your case in plain terms, or I shall return to mine." The girl didn't seem to take offense. She gave a small nod. "I'm Martha Kessler. I've worked for Mrs. Arkrite, Clarissa, for 3 years. She was found dead this morning, strangled." Wolfe exhaled audibly. "And the police believe you did it?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I didn't cry." That gave him pause. Wolfe, who loathed sentiment and considered tears an evolutionary defect, narrowed his eyes. "I see." "They asked if I had grieved. I said I didn't know how. That was enough for them." "Did you kill her?" "No." "Why come here?" because if I go to prison for something I didn't do, I'd rather the one man who's supposed to know the difference had the chance to say something. Wolfe raised a brow. Flattery will not spare you, nor will silence. I'm not being silent, she replied. I'm just not crying. He grunted again, leaned back, and steepled his fingers. Miss Kessler, I deplore unverified emotion, but I despise poor logic even more. Archie, get her a towel. The towel, monogrammed, white, and slightly offended to be in such use, sat folded on her lap, untouched. Wolfe had shifted once in his chair, enough to allow the expression of boredom to settle properly on his face. Miss Kessler, you came here, unsolicited, with no evidence and no fee. You claim innocence, but offer no explanation. You expect me to what? Divine your virtue from the absence of tears? She didn't blink. I don't expect anything, except maybe to be heard once before the door closes. He waved a hand as if swatting a philosophy fly. You have been heard. Now you may be gone. That would have been that, but Wolfe, for all his deliberate cruelty, gave her one final glance. Perhaps it was the restraint she wore like armor, or the way she hadn't once tried to beg. Whatever it was, he noted it, dismissed it, and turned to me. See her out. She rose without a word, handed me the towel, and walked toward the vestibule like someone heading into weather she knew well. I didn't like it. But then Wolfe wasn't paid to like anything, and neither, officially, was I. She stood on the stoop with the rain at her shoulders and a kind of dignity that didn't match the sag in her coat. I didn't offer her a cab. I didn't offer anything. But I watched as she walked east with slow, certain steps like someone who'd already practiced her path. Inside, Wolfe was back in his chair, eyes shut, hands folded across his considerable middle. She's lying, he said. Maybe, but not the way you think. He grunted. I've seen liars, I went on. They twitch, they avoid, they hedge. She didn't do any of that. It wasn't innocence, just not guilt. Fascinating, Wolfe muttered. Perhaps tomorrow we can arrange a conference of midwives to divine the character of silence. I didn't answer, mostly because I couldn't shake the feeling that the girl had said more by what she didn't do than most people managed with a paragraph. The next morning brought bacon, Rainlight, and Inspector Kramer. Of the three, only the bacon had earned its place. He showed up at 9:30 with his usual bouquet, wet coat, sharp jaw, and a suspicion that Wolfe knew something he didn't. Where is he? He barked. And don't give me that crap about orchids. I shrugged. I wouldn't dream of depriving you. He's in the plant rooms. Kramer looked like he wanted to stomp something, preferably ceramic. Martha Kessler's in custody. That brought Wolfe to the threshold of the room, napkin in hand, one brow elevated as though mildly inconvenienced. So you've arrested the girl who doesn't cry. She lawyered up, but not before we had a full statement. You saw her, didn't you? I saw a young woman in need of a coat, Wolfe said. The rest I left to the weather. Kramer's frown deepened. He knew Wolfe wasn't finished. She came out with 2 officers, one at each elbow, though she didn't need either. Her hands were cuffed in front of her, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. She wasn't fighting, she wasn't resisting, she wasn't anything. I watched from the front window, half concealed by the curtain, as they guided her down the steps. Wolfe stood behind me, unusually silent. I didn't ask what he was thinking. I knew better. But I saw his fingers pressed together at the knuckles, his version of a flinch. The squad car door closed with a mechanical finality. She didn't look back. Not at the house, not at the city, not at me. Some people weep when they're innocent. Some when they're guilty. She had done neither. Still not crying, I said softly. Wolfe sniffed. Possibly the only honest thing about her. But the way he said it didn't sound like dismissal. It sounded like curiosity. There are some houses that smell like fresh linen and money. The Arkrite residence, despite the polish and polishers, carried the unmistakable odor of restraint, the kind that gets baked into walls over time and doesn't air out just because someone lights a candle. West End Avenue had its share of stately dysfunction, but this one was thick with a type of hush that made your spine reconsider its posture. The door was opened by a man who didn't introduce himself, which saved me the trouble of remembering. He led me down a corridor with velvet drapes that hadn't been cleaned since the Hoover administration, and into a drawing room that had seen better arguments. Peter Arkrite was waiting, with a cup of tea he wasn't drinking, and a pulse you could practically hear. His wife Beryl came in 5 minutes later, in heels too high for grief, and perfume that entered the room before she did. Peter blinked too often. Beryl blinked never. The room blinked not at all. If there had been love here once, it had been folded, pressed, and buried with the silver. I said hello and let the silence test me first. Peter Arkrite looked like a man trying to sit through his own execution with dignity and failing. He kept touching the edge of his cup as if it might whisper instructions. Beryl, on the other hand, perched at the far end of the settee and didn't so much speak as lance words across the room. My mother-in-law, she said, was a master of tension. She'd make a violin string seem loose. She was precise, Peter murmured. Not cruel. Beryl's eyebrow ticked. She once made Martha iron a set of linen napkins twice in a row because the crease ran a millimetre too wide. That was the first mention of Martha's name, and I let it hover. She snapped, Beryl added, without waiting for the question. Clarissa accused her of stealing a brooch. She had these fits, you know, blank stares, silent as death. I told Peter we needed to let her go, but he's... Well, I don't think she was dangerous, Peter said quickly. I didn't say what I thought. Not yet. They had rehearsed their parts, that much was clear. The question was whether they were doing it to protect someone else, or themselves. The theft, as they told it, had happened 2 days before the murder. A brooch had gone missing, a small antique ruby number Clarissa supposedly wore only on holidays. The accusation came without proof, without witnesses, and without much volume. Just a few pointed words directed at Martha during dinner when the rest of the help was conveniently absent and Peter was reading the paper. Martha didn't deny it, Beryl said. She didn't say anything. Peter shifted in his chair. But it was never found. Of course not, Beryl said, with the smile of a woman who'd swallowed the brooch herself. I asked whether Clarissa had filed a report. No, Peter admitted. She intended to handle it. Privately. Which meant no record, no confrontation, and no way to tell whether the brooch was ever missing to begin with. Martha's silence might have been fear, or merely fatigue. Either way, it was a tidy motive. Too tidy. Clarissa Arkwright's lawyer, a man named Julius Sayer with a voice like overcooked oatmeal, arrived precisely on schedule to read the will. He wore a grey suit, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of expression usually reserved for public apologies. The will itself wasn't long, but it had the punch of a brass knuckle. Everything, the house, the accounts, the assets, went to Peter Arkwright. Beryl's name wasn't mentioned once, not in bequests, not in condolences, not even in punctuation. She didn't blink. She folded her hands and smiled with teeth. Well, she said, I suppose I should be grateful not to have to manage any antiques. I always thought the dining room was insufferably provincial. Peter tried to protest, mumbled something about fairness, but Beryl cut him off with a look that could have stripped varnish. Sayer excused himself after the reading. He seemed in a hurry to be elsewhere. If Clarissa had wanted to light a match from the grave, she had succeeded. The air had changed, not heated, frozen. Inheritance had a way of doing that. Nothing says love like a ledger, and nothing says motive like being left out of one. Martha's quarters were on the 3rd floor, tucked behind a corridor that smelled faintly of starch and furniture polish. A housemaid's room, the kind designed to go unnoticed by both guests and conscience. I had been in cleaner closets, The room was small, square, and unreasonably immaculate. One narrow bed, one dresser, one chair, a Gideon Bible in the drawer, untouched. The kind of living that didn't leave fingerprints, no photographs, no books, no notes, not even a laundry stub. It looked less like someone lived there and more like someone had been allowed to. I checked under the mattress, behind the mirror, and in the lining of the one suitcase in the closet. Nothing. Not even a thread out of place. A life that neat doesn't happen naturally. It's scrubbed, pared down, pruned to the bone. I've seen rooms that hide secrets. This one hid the absence of them, which in a way was worse. The fireplace was old, bricked, and badly maintained. Still, it had done its job. The contents of the waste bin, which included what looked like a torn envelope and the corner of a monogrammed napkin, had burned well enough to suggest someone knew what they were doing, but not perfectly. Among the charred scraps tucked under a half-scorched newspaper page was the bottom fragment of a document. Heavy paper, the edge of a signature, just enough curve and ink to be suggestive. Julius. I didn't pocket it, not right away. I stared at it for a moment, weighing the possibility that Martha had burned it herself. But it didn't track. The paper was legal stationery, the kind you don't steal from the kitchen drawer. If Sayer had been here recently, that made things complicated. He hadn't looked like a man eager to remember where he'd been. But paper has a habit of remembering for you. I put the scrap in my notebook, carefully folded. The thing about fires is they're only useful when they burn everything. And this one hadn't. I phoned Julius Sayer the next morning, using the number from his business card. He answered on the second ring, bland as chamomile. "No, Mr. Goodwin," he said. "I haven't set foot in the Arkrite home for over a month. I'd hardly be welcome, given the familial tensions." His voice didn't twitch, didn't rise, just smooth, even denial. I thanked him and hung up. If lying were a paid profession, Sayer wouldn't just be licensed, he'd be tenured. The only problem was the ashes in Martha's fireplace had a better memory than he did. The doorman 2 buildings down was a smoker with good eyesight and no particular love for lawyers. When I showed him Sayer's photo, he didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said. "That one. Parked his Packard outside on Monday night, left in a hurry." Monday night, the night before Clarissa Arkwright's death. I thanked him and slipped him a bill folded tight enough to suggest discretion. Back in the cab, I looked out over the avenue, wet and gleaming with morning drizzle. Sayer hadn't just lied, he'd lied cleanly, which meant, more than likely, he'd lied before. And Wolfe was going to enjoy that. Brooklyn has a memory for people who try to disappear. Martha Kessler's trail didn't vanish so much as it never sparkled to begin with. She had been born in Flatbush, a neighborhood where quiet didn't mean peace, and registered under the same name she gave us, which these days is no small mercy. Her school records were thin, her address, history, unadorned, and her employment progression read like a straight line with no deviation. Domestic work, 1 agency, 5 placements in 9 years. Maison Blanche was the agency that had represented her, and I use the word carefully. Represented, not employed. They didn't hold her hand, they polished her file. She had started with them at 19, no complaints filed, no jobs abandoned, no character references questioned, everything in order, sealed and dusted, the kind of record that looked less like it had been earned and more like it had been preserved. If she'd ever taken a misstep, someone had tucked it out of sight, a woman who made herself invisible for a living, and apparently for survival too. But what caught my attention most wasn't the clean paper trail. It was how badly it wanted not to be noticed. Maison Blanche had offices on Madison, 3 floors above a French perfumer who took his vowels too seriously. The waiting room was all white paneling and silver appointments, with just enough upholstery to suggest civility. I gave my name to a secretary who looked like she'd been trained not to smile without written authorization, and 5 minutes later I was ushered into a room that could have been an operating theatre for reputations. Odette Dembski stood, extended her hand, and smiled precisely once. She was in her 40s, elegant in that Manhattan way that made you forget what she was selling. Her suit was navy, her perfume discreet, and her handshake dry. "Yes, Miss Kessler is, or was, one of ours," she said, taking her seat. She was reliable, punctual, unobtrusive. That last word hung in the air like a feather made of ice. "She was the kind of woman who didn't attract trouble," she added. "But sometimes trouble notices." I raised a brow. "And did it?" Odette looked at me with eyes that had learned discretion the hard way. She did her job. Others, occasionally, failed to understand the limits of employment. It wasn't the praise that lingered, it was the warning beneath it. Odette poured herself a small glass of mineral water with the air of someone who'd once been mistaken for indifferent and never forgave the world for it. She didn't lean in or drop her voice. She didn't need to. "There was one incident," she said, tracing the rim of the glass. "Several years ago. A client, prominent, married, generous to a fault. His wife found a letter. Nothing explicit, but enough to be uncomfortable." She looked at me levelly. It was addressed to Martha, handwritten, short. "From the gentleman himself?" "From the gentleman." And signed. I waited. She didn't elaborate. I gave her a few seconds, just in case the silence wanted to confess. "She brought it to me," Odette continued. "Unopened. Said she found it on the nightstand, not delivered, not wanted. She asked to be reassigned immediately, no fuss." "And was she?" "Yes, quietly. There were no further communications. I didn't ask for the name, she wouldn't have given it. But I knew what I was hearing. Martha didn't take the bait. She buried it. And Maison Blanche, in turn, buried her loyalty in a manila file. That kind of obedience isn't always virtuous. Sometimes it's survival. It was after dinner and before brandy when the bell rang, a chime short enough not to be intrusive, long enough to be reluctant. Fritz opened the door, took the man's coat, and introduced him as Mr. Peter Arkrite. Wolfe was in his chair, buttering a peach tart as if it was sacred scripture. "Mr. Wolfe," Peter began, "I've come, not for your services, but for your discretion." Wolfe didn't look up. "I do not sell discretion, I exercise it." Peter faltered. I motioned for him to sit. He remained standing. "I'd prefer," he said, "that your interest in this matter ceased." Quietly. Wolfe set his fork down with the delicacy of a surgeon placing a scalpel. "That is not an option," he said. "I can pay." "You cannot." Peter swallowed. "You don't know what it's like, living with the echoes of a house like hers." "No," Wolfe said. "I live with orchids. They are silent and do not lie." Peter reached into his coat, pulled out a checkbook. Wolfe rose half an inch in his chair. "You insult yourself." I watched Peter's hand tremble as he put the checkbook away. He looked like a man halfway to collapse, but trying to outrun it anyway. Peter left without shaking hands, and Wolfe didn't watch him go. He simply reached for the brandy and poured with the serenity of a man who'd just refused a bribe, as easily as most men refuse a second dessert. "That was graceless," I said. "It was revolting," he replied. "And revealing." "He's scared." "Yes, but not of guilt." Wolfe sipped, thoughtful. "He's afraid of something he hasn't yet named, and he hopes that by paying us to look away it will remain unnamed." "Would you have taken the money if he'd asked us to look harder?" "No, but because he wouldn't have meant it." There was a pause, the kind that usually signaled retreat to the orchid room, but Wolfe didn't move. "He stinks of fear," he said, "but not his own. Someone else's, absorbed, like smoke." I didn't ask what that meant, I just filed it. When Wolfe starts talking in metaphors, something usually burns. The address belonged to a Mrs. Genevieve Toole, retired, widowed, and proud of her time in domestic service. She met me in the parlour of a second-floor walk-up in Queens, wearing pearls that had seen better decades and a house dress with dignity sewn into every stitch. "Miss Kessler?" she said when I asked. Quiet. Too quiet, maybe. Never raised her voice. Never said a bad word about the family, even when it was earned. I nodded, let her memory unfold. There was a time, she continued, about a year in, I saw something. Her wrist. Left one, bruises. Faint, yellowed. She said she fell against the cupboard. But you learn to read that sort of thing. Did you ask? She hesitated. I did, once. She looked at me. Not with fear, exactly. Not shame, either. Just the kind of sadness you save for later. The kind you don't let anyone see. Did you report it? No, she said. She asked me not to. Why? Because, Mr. Goodwin, she replied. She didn't want the person who hurt her to lose their job. There are loyalties and there are prisons. Martha had built both and chosen to stay inside. Wolfe was seated in the office when I returned, a volume of Seneca in his lap and a half-glass of beer untouched on the tray beside him. She wouldn't let him be punished, I said, after relaying the conversation. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he closed the book with a click that felt final. Call Kramer. I raised an eyebrow. What for? To tell him, Wolfe said, that I suspect he has arrested the wrong person for the right reasons. That'll go over well. It needn't go over, it only needs to be said. I went to the desk, picked up the phone. Wolfe continued, more to himself than to me. There is a type of crime, he murmured, that wears righteousness like a veil. Convenient, timely, and always slightly too neat. Meaning? Meaning, Wolfe said, the first death was a beginning, not an ending. That was when I started to get the itch. Wolfe rarely calls Kramer early, and never without good reason. The call came in just after breakfast. Eggs, soft, coffee hot, butter whipped, and Wolfe already deciding which part of the day to disdain first. I took the receiver and held it just far enough to dull the voice on the other end. It was Lieutenant Rowcliffe, which meant the news was grim and the tone was smug. Odette Dembski, founder and head of the Maison Blanche domestic agency, had been found dead in her office. Apparent overdose, typed note on her desk, no sign of struggle. I dressed quickly and took a cab uptown. The office, usually primped to within an inch of its own perfection, was uncomfortably clean. Unnaturally so. Dembski's body had already been taken away, but the scent of powder and alcohol lingered like unfinished business. The note, scented perfectly, no tears, no blot, read, I helped her. I shouldn't have. I can't go on. Signed, simply, Odette. I stared at it longer than I meant to. Suicide notes don't usually apologize like business memos, and people who take sleeping pills rarely leave everything this tidy. I lit a cigarette I didn't need and waited for the first lie to announce itself. It wouldn't be long. Wolfe read the note that evening, holding it between thumb and forefinger, as though afraid it might transfer vulgarity. When he was done, he dropped it on the desk and reached for a peach. She didn't write this, he said. Her secretary says it's her machine, I replied. Same ribbon, same plate and pressure. I didn't say she didn't type it. I said she didn't write it. That earned him a glance. She dictated, he continued, chewing delicately. Always. I checked her correspondence when you were out. Her letters were composed by a girl named Lenora. Blue ink, careful cursive. Miss Dembski dictated, reviewed, then signed. Maybe she made an exception. She didn't. I waited. He didn't move. The syntax is wrong, he said finally. Look at it. I helped her. I shouldn't have. I can't go on. That's guilt, stripped of voice. It's a caption, not a confession. I don't know, Wolfe. People say strange things when they're about to die. Not that strange, and not that efficiently. I didn't argue. He was right. The note had all the warmth of a warning label, and whoever typed it had intended it to close a door, not open one. Kramer arrived an hour later, trench coat damp, jaw set like he was chewing a marble. Fritz let him in, barely concealing his opinion of guests who came without manners or prior appointment. She left a note, Kramer said. It checks out. No signs of forced entry, no wounds, pills in the drawer, case closed. Wolfe didn't answer. He simply looked at him as if he'd found something unwelcome in his beer. "I know that look," Kramer growled. "You think she was murdered?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that death by pill bottle rarely cleans up after itself." Kramer scowled. "You don't like it because it's too easy?" "I don't like it because it's too complete." "You want to poke around?" Wolfe waved at me. "Send him." Kramer sighed, muttered something about orchids and egos, and left. Wolfe watched him go, then said, almost to himself, "They wanted this to be the end," which is how I knew it wasn't. The Dembski office had already been combed by the official crew, which meant anything left was either unimportant or inconvenient. I had a preference for the latter. The desk was immaculate. Too immaculate. No coffee ring, no pencil shavings, no dust beneath the letter tray. Then I noticed the chair, Dembski's, the big one, was slightly askew, as if someone had turned it hastily, then tried to reposition it without caring whether it aligned with the carpet's pattern. The ashtray, usually on the side table, had been emptied, rinsed, and replaced. No residue. But the glass, the tumbler she used for her late afternoon whiskey, was missing. Not washed. Gone. I opened drawers, checked underneath the rugs. Nothing. But there was the faint smell of sandalwood cologne lingering near the radiator. Something sharper than the usual perfume, and not hers. I made a note of it. Whoever had staged the scene hadn't understood grief. They'd understood appearance. And that's what unsettled me. A real suicide is messy, irrational, unfinished. This wasn't that. This was punctuation, which meant someone had written the sentence for her. And now they wanted us to believe it had ended there. Back in the lobby, I found the building maintenance man having a cigarette and a sandwich he didn't seem to enjoy. I showed him a photo of Peter Arkrite. "Yeah," he said, pointing with the butt of his smoke. "That guy was here Monday night." "Time?" "Late, after 10, didn't stay long." "Sure it was him?" "I don't forget faces," he said, "especially ones that look like they just walked out of confession." I thanked him and made a note. Peter hadn't mentioned being anywhere near Maison Blanche. But then again, people with secrets don't always file itineraries. As I left, I noticed a faint smear of something dark on the brass door handle. Not fresh, but not old either. Guilt, like grease, has a habit of clinging. Peter had been there. The question was whether he'd come for answers, or to make sure no one else got them. Wolfe emerged from the plant rooms with a cloud of damp air and disappointment following close behind. He took his seat, wiped his fingers, and looked at me like he'd expected better weather and better people. "She's dead," I said. "Everything points to suicide, except all the things that don't." He nodded. Tacitus once wrote, "They make a desert and call it peace." Is that your way of saying this was too tidy? Number, it's my way of saying silence can be cultivated, as can grief, as can murder. You think someone shut her up? I think, he said, someone ensured she would never speak again, and then dressed it as atonement. He leaned back, laced his fingers. We're not dealing with passion, Archie. We're dealing with preservation. I didn't reply. Wolfe doesn't throw Latin around for sport. Not unless something's shifted. And something had. The name had been buried in an old employment record, emergency contact, L. Kessler. I traced it to a Louise Kessler living in a tenement on the edge of Bushwick, 3 flights up and 3 decades removed from any family sentiment. She didn't ask why I'd come. Just opened the door, saw my face and said, "So it's Martha this time." We sat at her kitchen table. It was cluttered, honest, and smelled faintly of overcooked beans. "Martha never did learn how to be angry," she said. "She absorbed things, pain mostly." I let her talk. She had a baby once, years ago. Employer didn't like the idea of an unwed girl living under the same roof with a child, said it would ruin the household's sense of order. What happened? She gave the baby up. Reluctantly. No legal papers, just pressure and shame. Who was the employer? Louise met my eyes. She never said. But I think you already know. I nodded. It wasn't just silence that shaped Martha. It was obedience, the kind learned too early and left unbroken. And somewhere in that gap, someone had decided she would be the perfect scapegoat. He listened to everything, didn't interrupt once, and didn't move for the better part of an hour. Then he rose, crossed to the window, and stared out into the street like it had just confessed. 3 women, he said, each told to disappear in different ways. One erased her motherhood. One erased her guilt. One, Martha, is being erased altogether. His voice was low, clipped, but not cold. This isn't about one death. It's about the cost of knowing too much. I waited. They are not dying by accident, he said. They are being removed, efficiently, dispassionately, and with the comfort of plausible grief. He turned to me. That is intolerable. For Wolfe, that counted as fury. He lowered himself into the chair. Get me a list, he said, everyone with something to lose from silence broken. I nodded. The game had changed, and Wolfe, for once, wasn't just playing. He was angry. When Julius Sayer walked into the precinct that morning and asked to speak with the lieutenant in charge of the Arkrite case, no one knew whether to hand him a lawyer or a drink. He didn't ask for either. He simply confessed. He said Clarissa Arkrite had discovered a discrepancy in the household financials. A modest one, he claimed, a matter of client funds accidentally misdirected. When she confronted him, he panicked. That was the word he used. Panicked. He said he didn't know what came over him. He just remembered reaching for the nearest thing, a silk scarf, and the next moment she was on the floor, dead. He had come to clear his conscience. That was his phrase, not mine. He didn't want to live with the lie. Kramer had him in a holding room inside 15 minutes, dictating the statement like a man giving instructions to the undertaker. It was clean, too clean, like a window recently washed, to make the blood underneath look like rust. I didn't believe him, and Wolfe didn't even look up from his trout when I told him. He simply said, "Then the game, as they say, begins again." Kramer was grinning when he arrived. Not broadly, not gloating, just a small, satisfied smirk that said, "You boys can stand down now." He dropped a manila folder on Wolfe's desk like it weighed less than the truth it claimed to contain. "That's it," he said. "Signed, dated, airtight." Wolfe raised a brow without lifting his gaze from the crossword. "A confession is not a solution, Inspector. It is merely a statement of preference." Don't start. He had motive, means, opportunity, and guilt. You wanted logic. There it is. Too much of it? Kramer blinked. What? Too much coherence, too much moral clarity. Men do not strangle women in moments of panic. They strike. Panic is noisy, not methodical. You think he's lying? I think he's telling the wrong truth. Kramer's smirk faded. I watched the change. It was like watching a suit wrinkle under rain. Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Bring me the autopsy." The autopsy report arrived courtesy of Kramer's professional irritation, and Wolfe read it with the slow, indulgent patience of a man peeling an orange he already knew was rotten. I sat nearby, pretending not to read over his shoulder. "Ligature marks," he said aloud. "Parallel, uniform, consistent with narrow width binding. Abrasion depth suggests fabric, yes, but not silk." He turned the page. No fiber traces matching scarf weave. Mild bruising on the sides of the neck. Suggests restraint, not frenzy. "Translation?" I asked. Sayer claimed to have used a scarf. That would produce broad compression with minimal bruising. And we've got the opposite. "Precisely." I whistled. So he's covering for someone. Or being directed to confess by someone who misunderstands anatomy. I leaned back, crossed my legs. Any theories? Only that Julius Sayer wouldn't know a ligature from linguini unless someone drew him a diagram. I jotted that down for future use. Wolfe folded the report and set it aside. The question is not whether he did it. It is why he thinks it's better to say he did. Which meant, once again, we were no longer searching for a murderer. We were looking for a reason worth lying to protect. The adoption agency was nestled on a quiet corner of the Upper East Side, the kind of place where voices were kept low and walls were painted in earth tones to assure visitors that everything would remain both private and polite. I gave Martha's name, politely, and was greeted with the kind of smile that meant someone had already decided how little they were going to say. The woman I spoke to, mid-40s, pearls, tight perm, pulled a card from a metal drawer and made a show of squinting at it. Yes, Miss Kessler came here some years ago, but there was no formal application completed, no documentation retained. Why not? She pursed her lips. She declined to proceed, or someone encouraged her not to. Her hands folded, immobile. No comment. I dropped a name. Clarissa Arkrite. The pause was brief, but not brief enough. I'm not authorized to discuss any third-party influence, she said softly. Meaning there was some? I didn't say that. She didn't need to. I thanked her and left. Clarissa hadn't just controlled her house. She'd reached beyond it, silencing futures before they had the chance to grow teeth. And Martha, again, had swallowed the silence. Beryl Arkrite called and asked to meet, privately, discreetly, and preferably somewhere with candles. I chose a restaurant downtown that served spaghetti without pretending it was spiritual. She arrived on time, overdressed and underfed, and offered me a smile that suggested I'd been selected for a prize I didn't want. You look tired, she said. This case must be wearing on you. Not half as much as on the deceased. She laughed lightly, like it was a performance she'd rehearsed too long. Then she leaned forward, her perfume soft and familiar, jasmine with something sharper underneath. I'm worried about Peter, she said. He's not sleeping. He's talking to himself. Sometimes he talks to her. To Clarissa? No, she said, voice dropping. To the maid. I kept my tone level. Martha. She nodded. He's unraveling. I don't know what he might do. I took that in, then said, Why tell me? Her eyes flashed, not with vulnerability, but with calculation. Because you're listening. We finished our coffee in silence. She was fishing, but not for sympathy. She wanted a reaction, preferably one she could sell back to someone else, preferably Wolfe. She was lying, I said, but not badly. Wolfe, digesting both lunch and Beryl's performance, dabbed his mouth and set the napkin down as if it had offended him. Of course she was lying, he said, but not entirely. The line between anxiety and malice is thin, and she treads it barefoot. So, he said, you will follow Peter. For 48 hours, no exceptions, no substitutions. And Beryl? She is the type who arranges shadows and watches what they obscure. But Peter, he may not yet realize he's standing in one. I didn't argue. Wolfe doesn't issue directives lightly, especially when they cut into his routines. As I got my coat, he added, watch for guilt, but watch harder for pity. It is the more dangerous of the two. That was classic Wolfe, sending me after a man not for what he'd done, but for what he might still be willing to do. Peter Arkrite wasn't good at being inconspicuous. His idea of discretion involved looking furtive, checking over his shoulder, and parking too close to fire hydrants. I followed him through Brooklyn, down a quiet street near a block of modest apartments, and watched as he entered one with a brown envelope in hand and the gait of a man dragging chains no one else could see. He stayed inside for 20 minutes. When he came out, he no longer had the envelope. What caught me was who answered the door, or more precisely, who resembled her. A young woman, maybe 20, with hair pinned back and cheekbones that had Martha's same determined slope. Not identical, but close enough to make memory hesitate. I didn't approach, not yet. Peter walked away like he'd left more than just money behind, maybe regret, Maybe confession. I stayed until she closed the door and the hallway lights snapped off. Then I made my notes and returned to the brownstone. Wolfe would be interested, very, because it wasn't just the look of her face. It was the fact that when she saw Peter, she smiled, not like a stranger, but like someone who'd been waiting to be found. I didn't follow her. That's the part that stuck with me later. I didn't need to. One look had been enough. She opened the door, took the envelope from Peter with the caution of someone who'd accepted many things from him, but never once wanted more. She said nothing. Neither did he. She was about 20, light brown hair drawn back in a practical twist, thin but not fragile. And she had Martha's eyes, not the color, but the stillness. The kind that asks you nothing because it already knows too much. I made a quiet inquiry through a nearby grocer. Her name on the mailbox was Lucy Haskins. No criminal record, no aliases. Registered at the building for 6 years with references from a woman listed as her guardian aunt. It was the kind of paper trail that doesn't trip alarms but doesn't ring true either. Back at the brownstone, I handed Wolfe the details and he stared at the name like it had been carved into marble. Lucy, he said. A name for hope or loss. And the girl in Brooklyn? She wasn't part of Martha's past. She was the part Clarissa Arkrite tried to erase. Wolfe was not inclined to pity. That evening, he sat in his chair with an untouched bottle of beer and the quiet air of someone who had added one more segment to a larger curve only he could see. She remained in that house, he said, not because she was afraid, but because she was resolved. That is more dangerous. I waited. She gave up the child, he continued, at the behest of her employer. An act of submission, cloaked in necessity. But instead of retreating, she stayed. She remained in the orbit of the one who compelled the loss. You think she stayed to be near Lucy? I don't think, I observe, and the conclusion is geometrically inevitable. Meaning? She arranged her life in proximity, not power. She knew Clarissa had influence, but she didn't challenge it. She maneuvered around it, like water around a rock. I lit a cigarette, not because I needed it, but because the room felt full of things no one wanted to say. She survived Clarissa, Wolfe said, until Clarissa ceased being satisfied with survival. He picked up the beer. It is always the quiet ones who live at the fault line, until someone forces the quake. It took me a while to grasp it, not because it was complicated, but because it wasn't. Martha had stayed. After giving up Lucy, she had stayed on as Clarissa's maid, in the same house, under the same thumb that had pressed her silence into obedience. She dusted the same floors, poured the same tea, made the beds in which decisions were made that didn't include her. Wolfe, watching my face, spoke without venom. It was not martyrdom. Do not mistake it for that. It was endurance. Still seems like punishment. For whom? He had a point. Martha had kept close, not because she forgave, but because leaving would have meant surrendering entirely. Instead, she watched her daughter grow up through keyholes and borrowed time. Lucy had been placed with a caretaker, a nurse once employed by the Arkrites, according to my notes, someone loyal or indebted or both. Clarissa, it seemed, preferred her scandals buried under well-polished tiles. She'd kept Lucy out of the papers and out of the house, but not out of reach. Martha endured it all for a glimpse of something that belonged to her. And that kind of love, quiet, invisible, is the kind people underestimate. Until it becomes dangerous. The bank confirmed it. A recurring withdrawal from Peter's account in cash on the first Monday of every month for the past 6 years. Always the same amount, always handed off, never mailed. Wolfe, reading the statement, made no sound. Then he tapped the margin once with his index finger. An allowance, he said. Not charity, not control, guilt. Peter hadn't rebelled against Clarissa. He hadn't protected Martha openly, but he had tried, in his own cloistered way, to maintain a lifeline between the daughter hidden and the life denied, quiet enough not to provoke his mother, consistent enough not to forget the wrong. That takes some kind of backbone, I said. No, Wolfe corrected, it takes shame, which is rarely virtuous but often persistent. There was no doubt the money had gone to Lucy's care, and now that Clarissa had found out, there was no doubt it had also cost someone more than dollars. It was a letter, never sent, that filled in the blanks. Tucked in a folder of unrelated correspondence Clarissa had kept in her study drawer, dated a week before her death, unsigned, but in her handwriting. It referenced the girl and your involvement, and concluded with a chilling promise. This arrangement, if discovered by others, may be construed as criminal. It is better to end it now before the authorities are involved. Wolfe read it once, then again. She didn't intend to expose Martha, he said. She intended to accuse her, to frame her as a blackmailer. And that would have been enough? For arrest? Number but for dismissal, for humiliation? Certainly. The real weapon wasn't law, it was reputation. Clarissa hadn't just disapproved of the connection between Peter and Lucy. She'd decided to weaponize it against a woman who had already lost more than one name could carry. Peter Arkrite didn't answer the door right away. When he finally did, he looked like someone who hadn't slept since truth went out of fashion. I told him we needed to talk, and he didn't argue. I asked him about the money first. He didn't deny it. "She's my daughter," he said, voice catching on the word, as though it had just become real. I couldn't be her father, not openly, but I could support her. And Clarissa found out. He nodded. What happened? He sank into the armchair like someone being lowered by grief. She said it had to stop, that it was indecent. She used that word. I let the silence draw. She said Martha had threatened her, that it was blackmail. It wasn't true. Martha never asked for anything. But Clarissa was going to call the police. She said she'd destroy both of them if I didn't end it. And what did you do? He closed his eyes. I tried to stop her. The phrasing was careful, too careful. I waited. He said nothing else. The truth, or something dressed to resemble it, was finally out. But Wolfe would want to measure the stitching. Peter's account was recited with the steadiness of a man who had practiced, not confessed. I relayed every word to Wolfe, who listened with eyes half-lidded, as though conserving energy for disdain. He told the truth, I said, about the threat at least. Yes, Wolfe replied, but not about what followed it. You think he's still lying? Number worse, he's protecting. That's more difficult to dismantle. He leaned forward just enough to reach the beer glass and took a sip, more for rhythm than thirst. His fear is real, Wolfe murmured, but not of guilt, of consequence. That suggests he is either a coward or he believes the truth would cost someone else more than his own. Silence will cost him. I was already halfway to the phone before he spoke again. Summon them, he said. There was no trace of satisfaction in his voice, only certainty. I made the calls that afternoon. Calm, courteous, and precise, just the way Wolfe liked it. One by one they confirmed. Peter, Beryl, Sayer, and Martha, if the police would permit it. Kramer, of course, would come whether he was asked or not. Wolfe sat in the office like a judge awaiting the jury. Not impatient, not restless, just still. At one point he looked at the clock and said, "Tomorrow, 4 o'clock. That will suffice." Then he rose, not slowly, not dramatically, and walked to the globe in the corner, the one no client ever noticed, and turned it once on its axis. Truth, he said, is neither fragile nor forceful. It waits, but even waiting has its limits. He returned to his chair and closed his eyes. He didn't need to see the path ahead. He had drawn the map, and everyone else would arrive on schedule, whether they knew it or not. If you ever doubted that Nero Wolfe's idea of justice included upholstery, you've never seen him stage a finale. The drawing room was arranged with military precision. 6 chairs in a crescent, each spaced precisely 26 inches apart, with the 7th held in reserve for the suspect who would, inevitably, miscalculate her distance from the truth. Wolfe sat behind his desk, throned and immobile, as Fritz and I managed the logistics. Kramer's chair, leather, low-backed and strategically squeaky, was placed just to Wolfe's left. Martha's was set directly across from him. Peter and Beryl flanked her like decorative regrets. Julius Sayer would complete the set, a reluctant knight in a game Wolfe had already won. "Do not improvise, Archie," Wolfe said as I adjusted a lamp angle. "The mind resists symmetry only when truth threatens its convenience." "Understood," I said. "Truth, comfort, and light, in that order." He grunted, which meant approval in his dialect. By 4 o'clock, the chairs were filled, the tray held beer instead of sherry, and the room had taken on that certain heat that always comes just before something breaks. All that was left was for Wolfe to raise the curtain, which of course he wouldn't do by rising. Wolfe surveyed his guests with the studied detachment of a man appraising fish for freshness. No greetings, no preamble, just a pause long enough to make even Kramer shift in his seat. "I abhor repetition," Wolfe began. "It insults the intelligence of those who've already listened and the dignity of those who haven't. But today I shall indulge in it, not for your benefit, but for clarity's." His eyes narrowed slightly. "We are gathered here because a woman is dead. Others followed her, one by pills, another by shame. And all of it began not with a crime of violence, but with one of silence." He turned slightly, gaze sweeping the crescent. "Clarissa Arkrite ruled her house with exacting cruelty, not for order, but for control. And when that control frayed, someone chose to preserve its illusion through murder." He lifted a folder from his desk. "Over the past days, a confession has been offered, a suicide presumed, and a motive distorted, but none of it fits." He set the folder aside, untouched. "Because the truth, unlike guilt, is rarely convenient." I watched the room shift, just slightly. The Queen was gone, but Wolfe was here to name her successor. Wolfe turned to Julius Sayer with neither malice nor warmth, just curiosity wrapped in razor wire. "Mr. Sayer," he said, "your confession was noble, fatuous but noble." Sayer blinked behind his glasses. "I told the truth." "No," Wolfe said. "You told a version of it, crafted to absolve someone too fragile to bear scrutiny. Unfortunately for you, the autopsy disagrees. So does your signature, your scent, and your absence at key moments you claimed to occupy." Sayer looked down. "You protected Peter," Wolfe continued. "Perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of something closer to affection." Peter's head jerked. "But you are no murderer. You're merely a man who thought shielding the weak was better than exposing the corrupt." Wolfe folded his hands. "You're wrong, and you're not alone." Sayer said nothing, but his silence was no longer gallant. It was relieved. Wolfe leaned back slightly, the movement almost imperceptible. His eyes shifted to Beryl, but his voice addressed no one. "Miss Dembski's death was meant to be conclusive. A suicide, carefully staged. A note, typed, not written. A drink removed. A scent misplaced." He paused. "I say misplaced because it lingered longer than intended. Sandalwood, not hers, not Peter's, not Julius's." His voice lowered. "But yours, Mrs. Arkwright." Beryl tilted her head, elegantly still. "You visited her," Wolfe said. "To warn her, perhaps. To pressure her. And when she refused to be useful, or silent, you arranged her exit." Kramer stirred. "That's not evidence." "No," Wolfe said calmly. "But this is." He gestured to a file on his desk. "A silk scarf found in Miss Dembski's office, dry-cleaned, but imperfectly. Odette's initials embroidered on the hem, and faint traces. Sandalwood, your brand." Beryl's hands clasped in her lap, unmoved. "Your mistake," Wolfe said softly, "was assuming the dead stop speaking. But Miss Dembski was never good at silence. That was Wolfe at his finest, making the dead speak, without ever raising his voice. Wolfe reached for the smallest folder on his desk, a cream-coloured envelope no larger than a billfold. From it he drew a silk handkerchief, folded once, carefully. "This," he said, "was found in the glove compartment of your car, Mrs. Arkrite. Discovered yesterday by Mr. Goodwin. You will recognize it." Beryl remained perfectly composed. "I have several like it." "But this one," Wolfe said, "bears an invisible signature, Miss Dembski's perfume, a scent not sold in retail stores, mixed exclusively for her by a perfumer on Madison Avenue." Kramer sat up. "She was the only client," Wolfe added, "to wear it in the last decade, and the scent transfers easily to silk." Beryl's fingers twitched only once. "You drove to her office that night. You carried a scarf, a lie and a plan. The suicide was not yours, but the stagecraft was." He laid the handkerchief gently on the desk. "A careless mistake, yes. But sometimes murder unravels not through blood, but fabric." He glanced at me, then back to her. "And you, madam, are fraying." That was when the silence shifted from passive to afraid. And Wolfe, satisfied, resumed his stillness. "If you're asking why," Wolfe continued, "let me provide the courtesy of an answer." He didn't look at Beryl as he spoke. He addressed the room, a teacher correcting the syllabus of human failure. "Debt, not of the soul, of the bank. Your accounts, Mrs. Arkrite, were hemorrhaging. Gambling, mismanagement, perhaps revenge against the life you felt shorted. Regardless, you were drowning." He paused. "And Clarissa, the Iron Matriarch, had cut you off. Her will made that explicit." Peter stared at Beryl, who met his gaze without a flicker. "You hated her," Wolfe said, "not for her cruelty, but for her control. You loathed Martha for her silence, her loyalty, her invisible power. And you hated Lucy, the child who existed because you did not." A sharp breath caught in someone's throat, maybe Peter's. "You saw an opportunity to remove Clarissa, to frame Martha, to stage chaos as inheritance." He turned to Kramer. "There is your motive, cold, layered, and wrapped in silk." Then to Beryl. "And you, madam, are the hand that stitched it." For once, Beryl said nothing, and in that moment she was more dangerous than ever. Beryl didn't answer, not at first. She reached for her glass, found it empty, and let her hand rest lightly on the arm of the chair, a gesture too calm for a woman just undressed by logic. Wolfe waited. It wasn't patience, it was certainty wearing a cravat. Then she spoke. "She was always watching," Beryl said softly. "The maid, the shadow. I'd come down the stairs and there she'd be, dusting, folding, listening, like some monastic spy." She turned her eyes on Wolfe. "She didn't cry because she didn't feel. She was a mask." Wolfe didn't reply. He didn't need to. "She manipulated Peter. She made herself indispensable." "You projected your guilt onto her," Wolfe said evenly, "because she survived where you merely endured." Beryl's breath caught. And just like that, the unraveling began. Not with a scream, but a sentence that betrayed her more than any confession could. "No one ever asked why she didn't cry?" Beryl's voice cracked, sharp as glass. "Because she had nothing left, because she wasn't capable." It wasn't a defense, it wasn't rage, it was something closer to surrender, the kind that slips in when resistance becomes a burden. "She buried that child and kept serving soup," she spat, "like it meant nothing, like she was better than us." Peter rose, his chair scraping back. But it was Wolfe who responded, with silence, as weapon and shield. Kramer stood. "Enough," he said. "Mrs. Arkwright, you're under arrest." She didn't argue, she didn't weep, she simply slumped, like someone who'd just realized the silence she despised was her own. And Wolfe, expression unreadable, reached for his beer. Another silence had fallen in the room, but this one was earned. As they led Beryl away, I glanced toward Martha. She hadn't spoken once, not during Wolfe's monologue, not during Beryl's spiral, not during the verdict that had hung in the air like an old curtain finally torn down. But when the door shut and the room began to exhale, she rose, not quickly, not slowly, and crossed the few steps to Wolfe's desk. She didn't say a word. She extended one hand, fingers light as breath, and laid them briefly on the edge of Wolfe's sleeve. A gesture of recognition, or gratitude, or something too old for either word. Wolfe didn't flinch. He didn't look at her, but his hand for a moment stilled. Then she turned and left. I didn't say anything, neither did he, but I knew, as surely as I know the feel of handcuffs on a guilty wrist, that silence this time had said enough. It wasn't a scene built for headlines. No photographers, no triumphant handshake, not even a scowl from a beat cop to spice up the backdrop. Just a courthouse step, two women, and a sun that had no idea it was shining on the end of something. Martha stood still for a moment after the judge dismissed the charge. She didn't thank anyone. She didn't look for an exit. She waited. Not like someone hesitating, but like someone returning to her own rhythm after too long living in someone else's. Lucy joined her with a kind of hesitant grace that had nothing of youth in it. Whatever had passed between them, spoken or otherwise, had already happened before they reached the doors. I stayed behind. Wolfe wouldn't have come if you'd bribed him with pâté on orchids, but I watched. I have a fondness for quiet endings. They don't lie to you with ceremony. They descended the steps without touching. But they walked side by side, close enough that their shadows crossed and blended. You couldn't tell where one ended and the other began, and maybe, for them, that was enough. Wolfe had returned to his orchids, which was both indulgence and avoidance, depending on your view of human nature. But by dinner, he'd returned to the land of the articulate, provided the food met his definition of edible. We sat in the office, the house finally ours again, and reviewed the remnants of a case that had closed itself with the precision of a good novel, and none of the satisfaction. Wolfe sipped his beer with all the gravity of a man composing a will. Human nature, he said, has no instinct for proportion. The trivial offends, the tragic we absorb. I tilted back in my chair. You expected more remorse? No, he said. I expected more honesty. But remorse, like perfume, evaporates differently from person to person. I let that one float for a while. Beryl's motive had layers, I offered, but the outcome was simple enough. Outcomes often are, Wolfe murmured. It is the cause that lies. I left it there. The case was over, technically. But in Wolfe's head, the geometry of it would reconfigure itself for days. Angles of silence, vectors of guilt, and the shadows cast by things never quite said. I've seen Wolfe talk to a dead man's ledger like it owed him rent. But that night, he didn't reach for the files. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded under his bulk, and stared at the fire as if it were answering. Silence, he said abruptly, is the most abused medium of expression. I raised an eyebrow but stayed still. When Wolfe turned philosophical, interruption was the price of dinner. It misleads, he continued, because it allows projection. It protects, but often the wrong person. And worst of all, when it is misread, it convicts without appeal. Martha's silence? I asked. Her own form of penance? Wolfe replied, but not hers alone. Clarissa's tyranny was composed in silence. Peter's cowardice lived in it. Even Odette. She died because she broke it. And Beryl? Wolfe's lip curled faintly. She weaponized it and believed that silence could be shaped like an alibi. I stood, needing movement. Maybe that's what separates the innocent from the guilty, I said, what they use silence for. He didn't reply. But for a man who loathed stillness in others, he could make silence say more than most people managed with a confession. We weren't expecting company, which is why I wasn't thrilled to see Inspector Kramer darken our door with a half-chewed cigar and an expression that implied he'd just swallowed something philosophical and disagreed with it. You smug lummox, he said by way of greeting. "Good evening, Inspector," Wolfe murmured, not looking up from his bottle of beer. Kramer dropped into the red chair with the dramatic weight of a verdict. "You always wait," he growled. "Wait for us to stumble around the damn thing while you sit here counting petals and eating pig's feet." "If by wait you mean listen, then yes," Wolfe said dryly. "A rare talent in your line of work." Kramer snorted. "Don't get me wrong, I'm grateful, but I'll be damned if I say thank you." "That," Wolfe said, "would be dangerously out of character." The room, at least briefly, smelled more of tobacco than tension. Kramer stayed long enough to finish his cigar and half a bottle of Wolfe's beer, which he insisted wasn't terrible, the highest praise available from his quadrant of the human condition. "You're lucky," he said, wiping foam from his lip. "One of these days we'll beat you to the truth." Wolfe inclined his head, eyes half-lidded. "On that day, Inspector, I shall renounce deduction, close this house, and devote myself exclusively to horticulture." Kramer laughed. "You already do that." "Yes," Wolfe said, "but under duress. I would do it then with joy." Kramer rose. "I'll hold you to it." "No need," Wolfe replied. "You won't have to." When the door shut behind him, Wolfe turned to me. "I find Kramer oddly tolerable when he's losing." "Which is always," I said. "Just so." He raised his glass. "To justice, that most inconvenient of guests." And we drank. After Kramer left, Wolfe retreated to the orchids. Whether it was the scent or the silence, he claimed they were his best listeners. I didn't argue. You don't argue with a man who's just cracked a murder by naming a perfume. I stayed behind in the office. The room was quiet now, but not hollow. The kind of quiet that settles in after something breaks. Not noise, not relief, but release. I thought about Martha. She hadn't said a word in the courthouse. Not to the judge. Not to Wolfe. Not even to Lucy in any way I could overhear. But that didn't mean she'd said nothing. Some people don't cry. Some people don't shout. Some people tell you everything by how they don't look away when everyone else does. I wondered what Wolfe would have asked her had he cared to. Whether he'd wanted to know if she ever regretted staying, or if it was enough just being near the girl she'd lost. But Wolfe didn't ask questions he didn't need answers to. And Martha? She didn't offer what hadn't been earned. Some truths sit between people, and sometimes that's where they stay. The package arrived at noon the next day, wrapped in plain brown paper and addressed to Wolfe in the precise script of someone who has spent too long avoiding mistakes. I handed it to him after lunch. He grunted and opened it slowly, as if expecting the contents to argue. Inside was a small bronze statue. A maid, bent at the waist, head lowered, a single tear rolling from her cheek. Delicately made, old-world craft. There was a note, short, no greeting, no name, just, "She cries now, but only when no one's watching." Lucy Wolfe stared at it for a long time. Then he set the statue on the corner shelf, where the late sunlight brushed its face. He didn't speak. But later that night, I found the note still on his desk, uncrumpled, unread again. Even Wolfe, it turns out, knew when not to reread something too often. Wolfe went to bed early that night, an admission, perhaps, that some kinds of justice wear heavier than others. I stayed in the office. The fire had gone low, but I didn't stir it. Let it die, the way stories do when they've told all they can. I thought of the shadows on the courthouse steps, of a hand brushing a sleeve, of a woman who'd stayed silent too long, and a girl who'd finally heard it anyway. Not every case ends with headlines or handshakes. Sometimes the truth walks out quietly, arm in arm with what's left. I leaned back and closed my eyes. Wolfe might not have said it, might never, but I would. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes. In the hush that follows justice, there are no celebrations, only a shifting weight lifted, a silence broken, and the echo of lives rearranged. The truth, in Wolfe's world, is not a triumph shouted from rooftops, but a thing restored to its rightful place, like a name remembered or a weeping statue finally stilled. Martha walked free, Lucy by her side, and no one asked for thanks. Perhaps that too was justice. But tell me, do you believe some secrets are worth the silence they demand? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.